In June of 2015, a man was shot 6 times in the garden of his Essex home, and for almost a week, the police recorded his death as natural causes. His name was John Palmer, and the papers called him Goldfinger. He was one of the richest criminals Britain ever produced. At his peak, he sat level with the Queen on the Sunday Times rich list. But his murder is the end of the story. It begins in the sunshine on a Spanish island, with thousands of British holidaymakers robbed by a man they never knew. So how did a market trader from the West Midlands come to own a Spanish holiday empire, and how did it end with him dead on his own lawn? The answer runs through one small resort on the south coast of Tenerife, and through the 16,000 British families who bought a piece of it. Tenerife still draws millions of British visitors every year, and Playa de las Américas is as loud and as sunburnt as it ever was. What almost none of those 16,000 buyers understood was that the resorts they were sold and the companies that later promised to sell those same holidays back to them at a profit were controlled by a single man. That man was John Palmer, a gold robber hiding in the sun, and a court would one day call what he built the largest timeshare fraud on record. He did not do it alone, and he did not control every square foot of the island, but he opened the door. He showed a whole generation of con men how much money there was in a British family's fortnight abroad, and the fortune he ended up sitting on, the police believed, ran to £300 million. He owned a private jet, 2 helicopters, a yacht and a French chateau, all of it built, in the end, on holidays that did not exist. To understand how a furnace in a garden shed near Bath turned into all of that, the story has to start with the island itself, because the trap was already built and waiting long before Palmer ever set foot on it. For most of its history, the strip of coast that became Playa de las Américas was not a holiday destination at all. It was a dry agricultural plain in the south of Tenerife, planted with tomatoes and prickly pear, hot and stony and largely ignored. Tenerife had been shaped by a volcano, Mount Teide, and for centuries the island lived off the land and off the sea and off the ships that stopped on the long haul between Europe and the Americas. That passage to the New World is where the resort's name would eventually come from, the idea of the Americas glimpsed from a European shore. In 1962, a Catalan businessman named Rafael Puig Llovina looked at that empty southern plain and saw something almost nobody else did. He bought around 2.3 million square meters of it. There was next to nothing there. He called his project Playa de las Américas, and he set about selling it to Northern Europeans as a kind of European Miami, a place where a factory worker from a cold grey country could taste the glamour of crossing an ocean without ever leaving the continent. There was one problem the brochures had to solve. Tenerife's beaches were the wrong colour. The island is volcanic, and its natural sand is black. So the pale golden sand of Playa de las Américas was, in large part, shipped in from Africa, carried across the water grain by grain to make the postcard look right. Almost everything about the resort was manufactured. The beaches, the palm trees, the name, the promise, all of it built to order. This was a paradise designed, from the very first day, to be sold. For years it grew slowly. The first Grand Hotel, the Grand Tenerife, went up in the late 1960s, and the young Prince Juan Carlos, later King of Spain, stayed there with his family, which lent the raw new resort a shine of respectability. Next door, the old fishing village of Los Cristianos, which had watched boats come and go for generations, began to swell with hotels and apartment blocks and British expatriates escaping the cold. But what truly changed everything was an airport. In 1978, Tenerife's southern airport, Reina Sofia, opened its runway to the charter flights, and suddenly the tomato plane was hours closer to Manchester and Glasgow and Birmingham than anywhere with weather this good had ever been. What the airport delivered was scale, and scale was the whole point. Playa de las Américas had been built for the ordinary many, tens of thousands of Northern Europeans arriving week after week, all year round, into a resort designed from the ground up to sell to them. Hotels went up along the front in rows, and bars and clubs filled the streets behind. The place had no old town and no centuries of history to slow it down, because it had been conjured out of bare ground in a single generation, for one purpose, to turn winter sun into money. By 1986, the south of the island had overtaken the older northern resorts to become the tourism capital of Tenerife. The British came in their hundreds of thousands, and they kept coming year after year into the bars and the buffet dinners and the neon of what would become the Veronica's Strip. And they came for two things above all. They came for cheap, guaranteed sun, and they came trusting. That combination was the raw material for everything that followed. A British family who had saved all year for a single week abroad, warm and slightly overwhelmed and a very long way from home, was exactly the kind of customer a certain kind of business had been waiting for, and the business that moved in to meet them was timeshare. And it was their trust, above all, that was the product being harvested. These customers were, for the most part, ordinary working families. Factory workers, shopkeepers, retired couples, people who had never owned so much as a garage abroad and never imagined they would. They arrived without lawyers, without local knowledge, without a word of Spanish, relaxed and sunburnt and delighted to be there. They were a long way from anyone who might have quietly told them to slow down and read the small print. These were people who, at home, would never have committed to buying a property without weeks of thought and a solicitor to warn them. That instinct for caution did not travel well. Warm, relaxed, and far from anyone who might have raised a doubt, they could be moved to a signature in the space of a single afternoon. Their guard was down, and that was the whole opportunity. The idea of timeshare was simple, and on paper, it was not even a bad one. Instead of buying a whole holiday apartment you could never afford and would only use for a fortnight a year, you bought a slice of it. 1 week or two, the same fixed dates every year for the rest of your life. You owned a piece of the sun. You could come back to the same resort, the same balcony, the same view year after year, and one day leave it to your children. The pitch spoke directly to people who had never owned anything abroad and never dreamed they would. It offered them permanence, a fixed point in paradise that no one could take away. And that promise, the promise of owning it forever, was the hook that every other part of the machine hung from. Selling it required an army, and the army arrived. Along the seafront walkways of Playa de las Américas and neighbouring Los Cristianos, the touts appeared, thousands of them at the peak, commission only, known in the trade as OPCs. They worked the crowds coming off the beach, pressing scratch cards and free champagne and day trips and cheap watches on anyone who would slow down, all to get a family to agree to sit through what was described as a short presentation. The short presentation could run for hours. It was high pressure, tightly scripted, and finely tuned to wear a tired holidaymaker down until signing seemed easier than walking out. Salesmen worked in relays. The advertised price fell only if you signed that same day, and the free gifts kept coming until putting your name to the contract felt like the only way out of the room. A simple stroll to the beach became a gauntlet to be run every single day. And in time, the harassment grew so relentless that the island's own authorities began to fear it was frightening tourists away from Tenerife altogether. Even then, the very thing that made the resort its money was beginning to drive its visitors away. Into this world, in the middle of the 1980s, came John Palmer. He had not planned to build an empire here, at least not like this. He had arrived on the run, and to understand why, you have to go back to a warehouse near Heathrow, and to the crime that gave him his name. Palmer was born in 1950, one of 7 children, raised in a poor single-parent household in Alton, near Birmingham. He was a serial truant who left school at 15, and by his own account never properly learned to read or write. He worked for a while in roofing, then took to street trading, selling paraffin off the back of a lorry, before moving into scrap metal and then into gold and jewellery around Bristol. From a jewellery business he made his first £100,000, worth around £2 million today, and set up a firm called Scadlin, dealing in precious scrap metal. One of his partners in it, a man named Garth Chappell, would later be jailed for 10 years for his own part in handling stolen gold, because it was gold that made John Palmer, in the most literal way possible, through a single robbery that would shadow every year he had left to live. On the 26th of November, 1983, 6 armed men broke into a warehouse on the Heathrow International Trading Estate, run by a security firm called Brinks-Mat. They had been tipped off from the inside. One of the security guards, a man named Anthony Black, had passed them the details, and he would later admit his part and be sentenced to 6 years. The robbers came expecting to find cash. What they found instead, when they poured petrol over the guards and threatened them with a lit match until the vault was opened, was gold, around 3 tons of it, roughly 6,800 bars stacked with diamonds and cash, worth in total about £26 million. In today's money, that is well over $250 million. It was the largest robbery in British history, and as the gang drove away with a van sitting low on its springs, one of them reportedly wished the guards a Merry Christmas. 2 of the robbers, Mickey McAvoy and Brian Robinson, were caught and convicted within a year, undone in part by their own sudden wealth. Men from modest South London homes were suddenly paying cash for grand houses in Kent, and it was even said that McAvoy bought a pair of Rottweilers for his new mansion and named them Brinks-Mat. But catching 2 of the robbers did nothing to recover the gold, because by then the gold had passed into the hands of the men who really mattered, the ones who could make 3 tons of stolen bullion disappear. That was the true problem at the heart of the Brinks-Mat robbery. The gang was now sitting on 3 tons of gold it could not sell, because every bar carried a say-marks, a stamped identity that made it traceable the moment it touched the legitimate market. The men now holding it needed someone who could melt it down and bring it back as clean, anonymous metal. The scheme, devised by a Kent criminal named Kenneth Noy, was to smelt the bars and mix the gold with copper, altering its purity until it looked like ordinary scrap that could be quietly sold back into the trade. And the man with the furnace was John Palmer. In the grounds of his country house at Lansdowne, near Bath, Palmer melted Brinks-Mat gold in a shed, turning the crime of the century into untraceable ingots. What became of the 3 tons of gold has never been fully established, and most of it was never recovered at all. But the officers who spent years chasing the Brinks-Mat money reached one firm conclusion about where a great deal of it went. They believed Palmer had poured his share into Tenerife, into the land and the resorts and the villas. Over the years, in their view, that gold quietly changed shape and moved to the beach, from stamped bullion in a Heathrow vault into a holiday empire in the sun. In the eyes of the police, the robbery had bankrolled everything that came after, the seed capital of an empire in the sun. Kenneth Noy's own story shows exactly how dangerous these men were. In 1985, as police watched his home in Kent, Noy discovered an undercover officer, Detective Constable John Fordham, in his garden at night and stabbed him to death. He was acquitted of murder on the grounds of self-defense and only later convicted of handling the Brinks-Mat gold and sent to prison. A man dead in a garden and a killer who never quite answered for it. The Brinks-Mat gold, it would turn out, had a strange way of ending its stories in gardens. Fordham was only the beginning. In the decades that followed the robbery, a startling number of the people who had touched the gold, guilty and innocent alike, came to violent ends. So many that the crime writer Wensley Clarkson gave the pattern a name and a book, The Curse of Brinks-Mat. In 1990, Charlie Wilson, one of the old great train robbers, was shot dead at the door of his villa near Marbella in Spain, after £3 million of Brinks-Mat money vanished in a drug deal. The gunman shot his dog too, then rode away down the hill on a yellow bicycle. In 1998, a London jeweller connected to the laundering, Solina home, was gunned down outside his own home. Kenneth Noy, once released, would later be jailed for life for stabbing a young motorist to death in a road rage killing on the M25. By some counts, around 20 people linked to the robbery were killed over the years. John Palmer would one day become one of them. In that same year, 1985, as the police closed in and prepared to raid his estate, John Palmer took his family on holiday to Tenerife. The timing was no accident. Days after he left, officers arrived at the house and found the smelting equipment. Some of his associates were arrested. Palmer stayed in the sun, and when the BBC war correspondent Kate Adie tracked him down that year and filmed him beside a hotel pool, he simply sat there in the heat and insisted he was completely innocent, a man on his holidays who could not imagine what all the fuss might be about. He could not stay abroad forever. He tried to slip on to Brazil, but was turned back at the border because his passport had expired, and in the end he was brought back to Britain to stand trial. In 1987, John Palmer stood in the dock at the Old Bailey, accused of handling the Brinks-Mat gold. His defence was audacious in its simplicity. He admitted freely that he had smelted gold on his estate. He simply told the jury he had no idea it was stolen. From the start, he had accused the police of overreacting, and by his own poolside account in Tenerife, he was completely innocent of anything to do with what he kept calling the Matsbrink raid, muddling the name of the robbery until it seemed to lose its shape and its menace. He kept up the same trick in the dock, and it worked. The jury believed him. He was acquitted, and as he walked free, he blew kisses to the jurors from the dock. Kenneth Noy went to prison. John Palmer walked out into the sunshine and went straight back to Tenerife to build. Timeshare was the perfect business for a man like him. It dealt in cash, in trusting foreigners far from home, in a product whose real worth was almost impossible to pin down, and it was barely regulated at all. He had the money from the gold to put up the resorts, the nerve to sell them hard, and the muscle to keep order on the strip. The bolt hole he had run to escape a British police investigation, became over a few short years the base of an operation that would take more money from more people than the robbery ever had. What he built began with a single resort called Island Village near Playa de las Américas. From there it spread. The resorts carried bright, reassuring names, places sold as the safe, sunlit investment of a lifetime. At the height of it, Palmer controlled around a dozen resorts and something in the order of 450 timeshare villas, run, as one account had it, with an iron fist. And the way the money was really made had almost nothing to do with holidays. It ran on a machine, and the machine had a closed, beautiful cruelty to it. The mechanism itself was simple and merciless. A family would be brought in and sold a timeshare week, and sometimes that week was in a villa that had not yet been built. That alone was a large sum handed over for very little. But the real profit came later, when the same family, having realised the thing was worth nothing, like what they had paid, tried to get out of it. At that moment, another company would appear, an apparently separate firm, offering to resell their unwanted timeshare for them at a large profit. Some were promised a return of many times what they had paid, so long as they first bought a second, more expensive property to make the deal go through. Others were simply told their money would be refunded automatically if the flat did not sell, so the families paid again, and the resale never came, because the resale companies were also Palmer's. There were no buyers. There had never been any intention to sell. The same man had built the trap and then sold people the way out of it, and both one after another to the very same customer. People, many of them elderly, were left paying for 2 holiday properties they had never wanted and could never use. One buyer described what it was like simply to arrive for the week he believed he owned. He and his family had travelled through the night. When they reached the resort, they were kept waiting 3 hours, refused their keys, and told to pay £460 in maintenance fees they had already paid by post and could prove with a receipt. There were heavies standing around, he said, and a long queue of people just like him, all being treated exactly the same way. The holiday of a lifetime had become a shakedown at the front desk. Now multiply that one family across 16,000 others, and remember that some accounts put the true figure closer to 20,000 people. The ones this fell hardest on were rarely the wealthy. They were pensioners who had put down savings meant to last the rest of their lives, families who had scraped together a deposit for what they believed was a smart, sunny investment. Some were left servicing 2 properties at once. Some handed over thousands of pounds to the resale companies and heard nothing back at all. One of them was a successful businesswoman who had always prided herself on being able to spot a con man a mile off. She was taken in exactly like the rest, and because the whole thing had happened abroad in a country whose laws and language they did not know, many simply gave up, ashamed to have been fooled, and told almost no one. That silence, in its way, was part of the design. People who blamed themselves for being caught were far less likely ever to come forward, and that word, heavies, was not decoration. Palmer's empire ran on muscle. His enforcers on the strip were reportedly known as clumpers, men with baseball bats whose job was to secure the best-selling pitches and drive rivals off them. He was said to rely on 2 South American enforcers nicknamed the Sharks, who drove about in a black limousine. His head of security on the island was a Lebanese associate named Mohammed Jamil Dabar, and Palmer himself, by several accounts, wore body armour beneath his designer suits. This was a holiday business the way a protection racket is a neighbourhood watch. The night spots along the strip saw the timeshare firms fighting over territory like street gangs, and at one point, a British man was shot dead in a turf war between rival operations. People were dying over the right to sell strangers a fortnight in the sun. The money that came out of all this was staggering, and Palmer spent it like a man who could not quite believe it was real. At his height, he owned a Learjet and 2 helicopters. He had a yacht, named the Brave Goose of Essex, reported in some accounts to be worth as much as £6 million. He had a French chateau with its own golf course, a mansion near Bath, and a collection of classic cars, Porsches and Ferraris among them. He was described as one of the biggest landowners on the entire island of Tenerife. His fortune was estimated at £300 million, and in the middle of the 1990s, that placed him 105th on the Sunday Times rich list, sharing the position with the Queen of England. A man who had left school unable to read was now, on paper, as rich as the monarch on the proceeds of holidays that did not exist. His reach stretched far beyond Tenerife. Palmer had documented dealings with the Russian mafia and with Romanian criminals. A Russian newspaper reported in 1999 that his private plane flew to Russia almost every week, from either Tenerife or Bristol, and his bodyguard was rumoured to be a former officer of the KGB. On his office desk he kept a small sign, and the sign read, "Remember the golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules." He made almost no effort to hide what he was. In his own mind, he was simply winning. And for a long time, he did keep winning. He had beaten the Brinks-Mat charge in open court, blowing kisses at the jury as he went. His timeshare operation was making far more money than the robbery ever had. His victims were scattered across Britain, elderly, often embarrassed, and mostly unaware of who had really taken their savings. The Touts kept working the seafront, the villas kept selling. From the outside it all looked like an ordinary, if unusually aggressive, holiday company, and the tanned man at the top of it looked like nothing more sinister than a self-made property millionaire with a very nice plane. So what finally brought it all down? The answer begins on national television. In 1994, undercover reporters from the ITV series The Cook Report went after Palmer, posing as criminals who needed a large sum of money laundered. Palmer, who could rarely resist showing off how good he was secretly filmed offering to help. He asked for a 25% cut of a supposed £60 million, and he delivered a line that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I'm not cheap," he said, "but I'm good." The programme was broadcast under the title The Laundry Man. The programme did more damage than any police raid. It turned the lights on for good, and it told the watching authorities and the watching underworld exactly what John Palmer was, in his own words, on camera, with a smile on his face. Behind the scenes, the state had already been watching him for far longer than anyone knew. It later emerged that an intelligence operation, codenamed Alpine and run from a base in Cumbria, had been monitoring Palmer since 1999 and would go on monitoring him for 16 years, including the years he spent behind bars. One of the most closely watched criminals in Britain was hiding in plain sight, in the heat, selling fortnights in the sun to families who thought they were dealing with a holiday company. The reckoning, when it came slowly. Police who had long assumed Palmer was laundering drug money began to realise something simpler and far larger. The timeshare operation everyone took for a pushy but ordinary holiday company was itself one of the largest frauds the country had ever seen, and the money ran into tens of millions. As the net finally began to close, Palmer had even tried to buy some of his victims off, quietly settling with the angriest of them to keep them out of a courtroom. He was arrested and brought back to Britain, and in 2001 he stood trial once more, this time accused of masterminding a vast timeshare fraud. Prosecutors put the sum he had taken at more than £45 million. The victims were counted at around 16,000, though some accounts, as we have heard, put the true number higher still. It became one of the longest fraud trials in British legal history. The hearing ran for 7 months, and when it was done, the jury retired for 21 days before returning, one of the longest deliberations the Old Bailey had ever seen. And in a final flourish of arrogance, Palmer had sacked his legal team partway through and defended himself, arguing his own case from the dock. This time it did not work. The man once nicknamed Goldfinger was found guilty of masterminding the largest timeshare fraud on record and jailed for 8 years, of which he served about half. His long-term partner, Christina Ketley, was convicted alongside him of a similar charge. For all his money, Palmer's private life was its own kind of wreckage. He had married a woman named Marnie in 1975, and on paper they would stay married for more than 40 years. She tried to divorce him 3 times, over his affairs and his drug use, and each time it came to nothing. By the end, he was no longer living with her at all. He had moved in with Christina Ketley and their young son, in the quiet Essex house where his story would finish. Years later, Marnie would write a memoir about her life with him. She called it Goldfinger and Me, and gave it the subtitle Bullets, Bullion and Betrayal. Even the sentence did not settle the account. A year after his conviction, a court ordered Palmer to hand over around £33 million, the proceeds of the fraud, money that might at last have gone some way towards the victims. Instead, the order was overturned on appeal on a technicality, and the money simply stayed lost. Then, in 2005, John Palmer was declared bankrupt, with debts of around £3.9 million. On paper, the man who had once been as rich as the Queen was now officially bankrupt, penniless and in debt. Hardly anyone believed it. The fortune had gone somewhere the courts could not follow, into chateau and offshore accounts and the long shadow of the Brinks-Mat gold. And it was reported that even from his prison cell, Palmer had been able to carry on running his affairs, the machine turning over quietly while its owner sat inside. Palmer came out of prison and did not stop. In 2007, he was arrested again, this time by Spanish police, and charged with fraud, firearm possession and money laundering. He and 10 others were due to stand trial in Spain over a property fraud on Tenerife. The Spanish case ground on for years, and it was widely reported that Palmer was manoeuvring for a deal, hoping to have the charges quietly dropped. He never saw it through. The trial went ahead in Madrid in the years after his death, and several of those involved were found guilty and sentenced. One of them, a man from the northeast of England named Richard Cashman, was jailed for having run Palmer's Tenerife timeshare operation on his behalf, while Palmer himself sat in an English prison for the very same fraud. The machine, it turned out, had kept turning without him. Palmer never heard any of the verdicts. By the time they came, he was already dead. By then, the machine he had built on the island had long outgrown him, and it had rotted the very thing it fed on. He had shown everyone exactly how it was done, and after him came a flood. A wave of operators launched their own timeshare resorts, not only in Tenerife, but across mainland Spain, and in Cyprus, Malta and Portugal, chasing the same trusting British families down the same sunlit walkways. The biggest of the ones who followed him, a firm that traded for years as resort properties and later as Silver Point, grew into one of the giants of the entire industry, and it collapsed in almost exactly the same way, only louder. In January of 2020, it stopped trading and was declared bankrupt with recognised debts of around €136 million, spread across roughly 1,500 clients, most of them British and German. Court after court had ruled against it, more than 1,000 rulings in the end. Investigators tracing the missing money found a corporate structure of more than 100 separate entities across 16 different jurisdictions, much of it running up into the British Virgin Islands, one of the world's great hiding places for money. The debt vanished into the same offshore shadows the gold had, decades before. The model had grown so large and so poisonous that it had begun to devour its own giants. By the time the courts finally turned, the damage ran across a whole continent. Spain's own Supreme Court began striking down timeshare contracts by the hundred, ruling that they broke consumer laws written in part to curb exactly the excesses Palmer had pioneered. Whole sales operations were wiped out. The industry that had once lined the Tenerife seafront with thousands of touts shrank into lawyers and liquidators and compensation claims. Within a single generation, it had collapsed into a byword for fraud, with firms now devoted to nothing but helping its victims escape the contracts they had signed. For the ordinary people caught in it, the ending was quieter and no less cruel. They had been sold a piece of paradise to keep forever. What thousands of them were left holding was a debt they could not sell and could not escape. Many of the contracts contained clauses that bound the owner in perpetuity, with annual maintenance fees that rose year after year, and in some cases those liabilities could pass on the owner's death to their children, turning a fortnight bought in the 1980s into a bill their sons and daughters were still paying decades later. Owners who wanted out found there was no way out. They could not sell the thing, could not give it away, and could not stop the fees. And the only escape anyone offered was the same trick that had trapped them to begin with. Another company, another payment, another promise to sell. From 2016, Spanish courts finally began ordering the timeshare firms to compensate their victims, and thousands of British owners started, slowly, to claw something back. But by then, many of the companies had been hollowed out, and many of the people who had been robbed were very old or already gone. And John Palmer never answered for any of it in a courtroom again. On the 24th of June, 2015, at the age of 64, he was in the garden of his secluded, gated home in South Weald in Essex, burning rubbish at the edge of his grounds. His own security cameras had caught him only that afternoon, pottering about the garden on a green ride-on mower, an ordinary man in the last ordinary hours of his life. Someone was watching him too. Police would later find a spy hole cut carefully into his garden fence, and they came to believe a contract killer had studied his movements for days. The shooting happened in the one corner of the garden his cameras did not cover. He was shot 6 times at close range, no shots were heard, and his body lay where it fell until his son's girlfriend found him about an hour later. Palmer had recently undergone open heart surgery, and when he was found, the fresh surgical scars across his chest masked the gunshot wounds. The officers who attended concluded that he had died of natural causes, and so for 6 days the death of one of Britain's most notorious criminals was quietly recorded as the passing of a poorly man with a bad heart. By the time a post-mortem finally discovered the bullets and a murder inquiry was opened, the scene had been disturbed and much of the forensic evidence was already gone. That failure would haunt the investigation ever after. In the crucial first days, when a murder scene should have been sealed and combed for evidence, Palmer's garden had been treated as the site of an ordinary death. A ballistics expert later concluded that the killer had used a silenced revolver, which was why no one in the house had heard a thing. 5 of the 6 bullets fired into him were recovered from his body, and almost nothing else was, because the scene, detectives said, had been professionally stripped of evidence. Once they understood what they were really dealing with, they believed the killing bore every hallmark of a professional hit. The gunman had watched the house for days, they thought, learned the pattern of Palmer's movements, and found the single blind spot in his security. In the days beforehand, 2 or 3 men had been seen digging in the woodland beside the property. Nothing was ever stolen from the house. Someone had simply decided that John Palmer should die and had paid a professional to make it happen. As for why, the theories all pointed back into the world he had built. There was the Spanish fraud trial looming over him, and the people it might have exposed. There were the underworld figures he had done business with over 3 decades, in Britain, in Spain, and in Russia. His name was linked, even at the end, to some of the men convicted over the Hatton Garden safe deposit raid of that same year, 2015, and in the weeks after his death, detectives worked with the flying squad to check whether Palmer himself might have had a hand in that Easter raid on the vault, and there had long been rumours, which the police themselves acknowledged, that Palmer had at times been an informant, a whisper that in his world could be a death sentence on its own. He had spent 30 years in the company of exactly the kind of people who kill to settle a score. The police believed that in the end, one of them, or someone paid by one of them, killed him. His family offered a reward of £50,000. His last movements were shown on Crime Watch. Detectives followed hundreds of separate lines of inquiry. One man in his 40s was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to murder and released without charge. And still, 10 years on, in the summer of 2025, Essex police were renewing their appeal because to this day nobody has ever been convicted of killing John Palmer. Officers believe the answer lies somewhere in the underworld he moved through, and they have said that loyalties change with time, that people who once stayed silent may finally be ready to talk. His family are still waiting for an answer. The case is open, The killer is still out there. Palmer's widow, Marnie, has her own bleak verdict on all of it. She has said there is more chance of the long-missing Lord Lucan turning up than of the police ever finding her husband's killer. The scene, she pointed out, was simply too convenient. He was found in the one corner of the garden he had never fitted with a camera, and his Rottweilers, the dogs that patrolled the grounds and that he almost never shut away, had for once been left indoors. Even she, who had every reason to want the case solved, admitted that in his last months her husband had let his guard fall. So the curse of the gold, if that is what it was, had come for John Palmer too. 6 bullets in a quiet garden. Whether you believe in such things or not, the shape of it is hard to look away from. He had spent his life watching ordinary people, learning their habits and their weaknesses, choosing his moment, and taking everything they had saved. At the very end, someone stood at a hole in his fence, watched him in just the same way, and killed him. Playa de las Américas is still there, still bright, still crowded. The touts are mostly gone now, cleared off the walkways by the same laws that finally caught up with the industry, and the black volcanic coast still wears its pale imported sand. Millions of British holidaymakers still fly in every year for a fortnight of guaranteed sun, and almost none of them know they are walking through the wreckage of an empire, or that the man who built it lies in an Essex churchyard with his killer never found. Goldfinger kept a sign on his desk that said, "He who has the gold makes the rules." In the end, a man with a gun and a hole in a fence wrote a different one. If you found this one worth your time, the video now showing on your screen is where this story carries on, and I think you are going to want to see it.